What's up, guys? Let's just take a quick moment to do what I call a sit rep, which means you press start, view your heads up display, and orient yourself to a strategically or mutually beneficial strategic direction. TLDR on spawn, press the start button, view your heads up display or your map, and take a gander at where you think enemy spawn is. If you are correct, my friend, you will get a kill. But if you're incorrect, someone dies. Now remember that this does not mean that creativity goes out the window. An army becomes invincible when there is a variety and variance in our attack vectors. Meaning by I approaching from the back, you approaching from the front, Ghost approaching from the west, and Price approaching from the east, we effectively crush enemy options at any and all possible counter maneuver and quite effectively take over the game, i.e. domination. Swag mantra, how do I actually cover a blind spot? Now, the point that I wanted to make is that all too often, I think we do not forget, or we often forget the importance of what I call line of sight and line of fire, right? So quickly defining this, line of sight is simply what you see right in front of you in this immediate moment, right? It's literally the view that is on the screen, right? Line of fire is effectively the zone of the fucking screen that is covered when one scopes in their target, right? Now, the point that I wanted to make, and if you recall, an army is comprised of two effective movements, an offensive movement and a defensive movement. And more specifically, the offensive movement is, as I mentioned previously, the movement that is oftentimes the one that should be more team oriented. Because if you realize that essentially you can do so much more when you effectively play with other people and do what I call LeBroning off of one another, you're able to essentially do so much more in such a smaller amount of time, right? Now, going forward, the cool thing about this is that when it comes to a team environment, one is able to better and quickly, effectively cover a greater zone of coverage, right? The way that I put this is if you simply take, for example, the fact that your line of sight only comprises about the zone that is from your, let's say, if we say 0 to be the line that is drawn, if you look directly in front of you, your line or your zone of coverage would essentially extend to your negative 70 or 80 degree to your 70 and 80 degree, right? So that means that essentially every individual by nature can effectively only cover 150 degrees in terms of actual effective coverage. Another way of putting this is, how many times have you been in a situation where you encounter Tango, but because they were coming at you from like a corner or an angle, you're not able to actually turn, swivel, and scope before firing upon them in a way that you get the kill, right? This is literally the point of playing together. Now, the point that I always try to say is position yourself within your platoon, within your squad, in such a way that you guys are covering what I call each other's blind spot. The blind spot can easily and always found if you go the 90th degree from you, right? That's literally the blind spot, meaning you can't see at that angle. And so for one squad member to actually cover that zone, you guys would essentially be increasing your overall effective coverage power, right? This is why the importance of essentially even if you want to put it using geometry, like your isosceles triangle, your equilateral triangle, literally makes you such a radically effective player, because you're able to take into effect the fact that these physical characteristics are always at play in operation, and you're better able to make decisions that will actually garner the results of achieving the mission at hand, which is eliminating as much, if not all, tango present, thereby defeating the opposing or oncoming enemy movement. Now, a distinction that I wanted to make is that oftentimes when we go about playing the game, we just willy-nilly pick a direction and we just run into it because we just figure, oh, it's just a grind, right? But we want to just take altitude in what they're doing and take a step back and realize that greater coverage distance, more effective kills, and essentially dying less will result if one were to spread themselves out in such a way that every single area that is not covered by a team member is a viable orientation to essentially direct themselves in. Would be essentially the way to always ensure that you could consistently contribute to achieving success or victory in the mission or the game at hand, right? Quite effectively, other people call this the white space, right? Where I would just simply define it as the region in the map where a squad member is not, right? So when you press the start button and you view the map, the white space is where a squad member or you are not. And it is essentially where we have a blind spot to where an oncoming enemy movement may be coming from. This, my friend, is what I'm talking about when I say orient or point yourself to a mutually beneficial strategic direction. Because when you and your squad mate are looking in the same direction, it does no good to the overall team effectiveness because it doesn't increase that zone of coverage. The way that I always put this is just imagine the shuriken, which is basically the six-sided or four-sided throwing knife from Naruto, right? The way it's made is that it has this like hollow center, and why it's important or what essentially makes it an effective lethal weapon is that it grants a rotational torque that as it travels through the air allows for curvature and projectile trajectory, right? So when you throw it, and by the way it's crafted, not only is it like a frisbee in the way that you can simply whisk it at someone and cause lethal damage, but it's torque caused by the flower or lotus aspect of the weapon itself lends for what you can essentially essentially call curving the bullet, right? So if you want to think of what's that movie? I think it's like Taken or whatever by I forgot the name, with Angelina Jolie and like that guild of ancient assassins just going around like curving bullets. This is essentially what I'm referring to. Now, bringing it back to line of sight and the white space, you want to essentially think of how you can overall effectively cover a greater zone, right? And basically, in summarizing the overall zone that is covered by the team, how you on an individual level can cover or help contribute to the team's covering of a greater zone of coverage. This is why looking in diverse directions, or what I call having a variety and variance in attack vectors, makes for a more radical and vital army element. You're able to not only just accomplish more because you're looking in a multi-dimensional myriad of ways, but you're also able to affect greater impact because you're doing things in a radically in a radical spectrum of approaches, right? Now, to bring it back, I guess to dial it back down to game speak, when you often think about how many times you scope in a target, but you do not get the kill, you get a sense between what I call line of sight and line of fire, right? Line of fire would be that moment when the target is scoped in and you're looking at things through the lens, while line of sight is just what you see on the just general viewpoint when the weapon is in your hand. By enabling yourself to essentially maneuver or position yourself in such a way to where you're always increasing the geometry that coverage zone covers, you're more likely to make higher level decisions when it comes to the strategic location of where you should be placed in order to either prevent, discourage, or even alter or shape the trajectory in which enemy will be coming at you. This is how higher or better decisions are made in the field itself. Now, to bring it back to a more higher level point, I like this concept called swag communications. And that to me is the standard or the way that I go about thinking about how an idea or a message is thereby conveyed or crafted, conveyed or shared or disseminated, and then ultimately received, consumed, internalized, and acted upon by the audience at large, right? And the simplest way that I would put this is in terms of visualizing it has three colored lines, right? A green line, a blue line, and a red line, right? One line has to do with the overall message itself, the idea, the symbol, and how it is expressed in its totality. So for my engineers, would be essentially the Nyquist sampling theorem, where you essentially always strive to capture the totality of the waveform itself, thereby ensuring that its complete essence is presently found, presently expressed, and then perfectly etched in the way you go about like thinking it conceptually for yourself, right? And then the medium, the modicum of distribution or transmission itself would be the way you go about talking about it. So audio, video, media, graphic, etc., text. Now, the point in understanding this is that for engineers, for example, we have called things like the dielectric constant, right? Or the fact that with every medium that wave or waveforms propagate through time and space, there is an inherent, if you want to call it, friction of resistance that is found in each of these things, right? When you're going through air, for example, you have actually, let's put it simply. In space, theoretically, there is little to no friction, right? So wave travels freely, right? But once it encounters an object, there is, you can call it an interaction of energy that is found, and thereby resulting in an exchange of energy, maybe in the sense of resistance, friction encountered, maybe in the sense of temperature change, right? Or maybe in the sense of like the physical property being changed itself. So like a rock getting splintered and fractured, et cetera, right? In the same way, in business development, marketing, communications, when someone watches a video, for example, the truth that their visual, auditory, and even all olfactory senses must be engaged has to be accounted in order to most effectively think about the idea that you're even representing. If someone needs a pure demonstration of you applying a particular concept in actuality to most effectively understand what you're talking about, then for the audience at hand to consume it in that way, for them to be engaged, the content at hand must also be done, expressed, delivered in such a way that those senses are activated, essentially, right? If someone is building like an is making audio content and like building a podcast, and the truth that the only thing by which the end subject at hand is going to have to access that content is the auditory senses, then things like ensuring that there is no background noise present to essentially always be able to hear you as clearly as possible, or to ensure that there is little to no chatter, so that way whenever the audio waveform is digitized through the different platforms, like when you upload shit on Facebook and then it goes through the process of being uploaded into a database backend before reaching your page content directory. Those truths must also be taken into account, because loss and value truncation will occur, and the reality of maybe losing a phrase, maybe not being able to hear a particular intonation when breaching upon a specific topic present or laden with nuances occurs, right? When someone is dealing with something like a simple graphic, the understanding of how it's presented in the different myriads of resolutions that are present in today's day and age must be accounted for, because for them to see the totality of the truth carried in that 1,000-form permutation that is the graphic or art at hand must be accountable and must be accounted for when the design process of manufacturing the particular art graphic itself is being done, right? So that's the point on always having care about what medium you're choosing, and specifically how the idea that you seek, the message that you seek to convey in the vehicle that is the content that you produce should have the relation that it must have in order to most effectively reach the bellies of the consumer or end subject at hand. Now, finally, in that, it's also interesting to note that, for example, when I go about thinking about writing a book, right? And to my mind, the idea, or even as I go about the process of it, typing words and words after hours and hours, my toll or my ability to maintain consistent higher level, you can call it output, when it comes to the decision making that have to do with picking the words that I'm going to use to convey an idea, or using the style of mannerisms that I'm going to choose to essentially express myself when using or building out a particular sub-motif, or if you want to call it brains or mind mapping point that is related to the hierarching motif presented in the book, has to also be accounted for, because that is also another point of contention, another point in which my inability to perform at the level required to choose a subjective realities that can most effectively pick the words style necessary to enact the changes in my subject are over a longer period of time, right? In this, it's kind of funny because the last point, emotional undercurrent, is, I think, in my opinion, the thing that is the most undervalued and under nurtured in most of operations today. We don't take the time to consider how someone's lifestyle, how they go about living on a day-to-day basis, the way they go about expressing themselves or moving through the world, if with ease or with a lot of hardship and strife, can actually dictate and define the very way they're even able to consume what you have to say, right? So put simply, I'm always thinking about the totality of the waveform of the idea vehicle that I have in mind. I'm always thinking about how I'm going to go about putting that into the world. And then finally, the experiences that bring me and the subject at hand together in order to most effectively come to a, you can call it synergistic relational rapport that allows me to better understand how they go about understanding what I say. The best example of this that I would essentially illustrate this with is just imagine something simple like, hello, how are you doing? Right? We often think um, what is heard is, hello, how are you doing? And then what's processed is uh, opening statement, um, introduction, and then maybe inquisition about current state of mind, right? But even as I'm saying this, there are literal points, chains by which breaking can occur, disconnect can occur, by which my hello, how are you doing can be heard, hello, are you doing? Hello, how? Or are you how? How are you doing? Right? And then resulting in the proper or the mal processing of the wrong thing or the processing or of a improper or incomplete thought idea waveform, right? So always try to find an alignment or to ensure that an alignment between these three different realms of operandi are present because it allows for a more complete and enriching multidimensional experience. Now, the final point that I guess wanted to leave you with is bringing back the concept of line of sight and line of fire is that as you go about doing communications, marketing, business development, lead generation, they should be a natural unfolding, or you can call it a organic evolution in what you are talking about by virtue of time unfolding as you do these things. Meaning, it is not a bad thing that you started talking about one topic, but then the nuance as you go about bridging these different worlds cause for a verging into a different side point that leads to the occurrence of coming onto or coming about of another point that may look or may at at first glance seem to be unrelated, but actually in effectuality have an intersection point, a la discrete mathematics, to the main point at hand. This, in my personal opinion, is the advantage of capitalizing on white spaces, on points that have not been covered by a squad member first, on points that have not, in or through your own eyes, been adequately met to, I guess, the satisfaction that within your body feel they have. Because thereby, my friend, you are, in effect, at that moment, bringing value to the world. And, as I always like to put it, contributing to the elevation of one's infinite potential and the unleashing of that phenomenal awesomeness. That was quite a mouthful. I hope I didn't lose you guys at some point and that you got something out of this. As always, swag the fuck out. As a side note to this, and one of the things that I particularly enjoy doing is essentially employing my heads up display and constantly updating it, constantly course correcting. So what do I mean by that? I basically every 1, 3, 5, 7 seconds press the start button, view the map, and get a beat for how things are unfolding. The reason why I do this is because oftentimes you'll actually realize that the game situation, the war zone, may be unfolding in one way that you didn't think it was. In one moment in time, it might be going in one particular sector of the map. And so it's beneficial to go counter to that. But then literally the next second, someone or Tango was able to take out four of us. And so it's actually conducive to run to that particular location and provide support. By always maintaining perspective and detachment over what's going on the fact that I died and trying to get a revenge kill, for example, and focus solely on just ensuring that I'm positioned where I'm supposed to be in order to effectively increase the geometry of the zone of coverage, I'm more likely to put myself in a situation where I can just catch enemy by surprise, where I can effectively make an impactful dent in their offensive movement, and where I can essentially subtly influence the fucking game, right? There's this thing called shadow programming, right? Or if you want to call it accessing the psyche, like the process that is the psyche itself. And conventional thought is actually that this is something that is not typically done or should not be done on a conscious basis, simply because the imprints that are formed at that level have so many ramifications to the creation of what makes a person, their personality matrices, their, I guess you can call it blooming abilities, capacities, and all the things that comprise them. That wisdom is actually to allow it to evolve and take its own course without conscious or constant, I guess, intervention or steering of, right? But one thing that I like to do is actually create karma, right? I'm always thinking, if I can always put myself in a state of mind where my thoughts, words, and action can just by nature, by virtue, be evergreen, then I'm more likely to position myself in a place within myself, from myself, where change and impact can actually be done, right? Where the produce of all of the things that I do, all of the things that I'm able to do, all of the things I'm able to take a part of can actually bring fruitful results that can be felt for times to come. So, in that, basically, I guess to put it more concretely, if one is to think about how to go about reverse engineering all of these things, reverse engineering being an impact maker, then the idea or the mantra should be a meditation of always thinking about stretching the boundary zone. In game speak, the idea would be always thinking about how can I make it to where the war zone is stretched, where there is more possibilities by my presence being at a specific, or what I call strategic location on the map, on the sector, or in the industry at hand.
Guys, Steven here today, and today what I wanted to talk to you about is swag communications. Now, what the fuck do I mean by that? Basically, I believe that in order to convey a message, there are three primal elements that are present. Importance or an adherence to the totality of the message, the modicum of transmission, meaning how it's actually expressed or shared, and then three, the emotional undercurrents, right? Now, oftentimes I think we feel as if by I having an idea and essentially saying it to someone, they not only hear me and get me, but they should do what I say, right? When oftentimes it's actually not the fucking case. If you think about it, that's literally not what happens 99% of the time. Let's just take this simple example. Hello, how are you? Right? If you play a telephone game and someone hears that, they will hear, hello, how are you, right? What's being processed, though, is a radically different story. It might be opening statement, introduction, right? Inquisition about one's current state of mind, right? Response, hey, thanks, I'm good. Thanks for asking. What about you, right? Then, so what you hear if telephone game is working well is, hey, thanks for asking. I'm doing well. What about you? Right? And what's processed is acknowledgement of a receival of original message, right? Processing resulted in maybe inquisition about processing, and then query found resulting in query found. Query is inquisition about current state of mind, right? And then response required, something like that, right? And so then what you essentially process is the next thing, and so on, right? What I'm saying is sometimes there's not always an alignment in what's heard and what's processed, right? What's heard could be radically different from what's processed. And when we essentially adhere to those truths, we gain greater clarity in the things that need to go about in order to ramify or align those different, you can call it spheres of reality or of being, right? So the simplest way that I would essentially illustrate what I'm talking about is just seeing what you're doing in terms of 3 lines, right? There is a green line that essentially dealing with the totality of the message itself, right? The green line is the very idea itself, right? The red line is essentially the method or mode of transmission, right? The modicum of dissemination, how it's actually put out into the world, right? And the blue line is the emotional undercurrent by which the recipient and you find yourself in when the overall totality of this idea is expressed, like as you are living and you come about the experience of the idea in its permutation. What are the very specific motor neurons, mirror neurons, neurochemicals, etc., that occur when that experience blooms, right? It allows you to get greater depth into what you're doing because you suddenly find yourself thinking about things like, oh, because I'm having to write a tweet, even though my persistence enables me to fully use multiple tweets if necessary to write the idea, the fact that I'm having to essentially cater to 140 character audience will cause maybe a lapse in their judgment. They may not read the completeness of the idea as it's expressed in that form, thereby getting error in perception, right? The wrong period in time in which the waveform is found. They may not get the Nyquist sampling rate, 2x suggested frequency of it, right? If I'm writing a paragraph or text and I'm thinking about how, or I'm going about the process of doing it, and the stress of literally typing things out physically causes maybe my getting taxed in ADP levels, I may not have the highest quality decisions when it comes to the words and subjective reality specifically chosen to express or convey messages and nuances or particular sub-motifs of the overall message that I'm trying to convey, right? If I am essentially creating an audio recording that is essentially demanding that the olfactory senses of my subject is not only of sound, operating state, but that also the very environment by which or in which I am recording this recording is conducive to my being heard in the most highest effective way, or the most, you can call it, intonally distinct way, then that is another point in which I can essentially cause error or loss of value to be present, right? When you think about all of these different things, you start realizing that there are so many things that go into the way someone consumes information. There's so many ways in which someone even takes in an experience. And it allows you to have a greater, you can call it appreciation for the unfolding of the very specific sequence of events that are to do with the discovery of, I guess, excitement of unpacking, consuming, processing, internalizing, and action taking moments of the overall journey, right? And because of that, it also gives you, I guess, a greater responsibility to ensure that even if one is not had stellar superior screen quality than another, or has eloquent sounding has another, or has verbose and extremely technology, you can call it fluent, than another, the very act of maintaining one's time, one's regard for their attention to mind allows you to just always try for the best that you can be, do, and emulate, if you will. This essentially coins or brings together all of the 3 points that I mentioned, right? In that, it also makes it to where you get a kick for the different ways of being, right? By building a video and understanding that the visual, auditory senses are present to essentially get the best out of seeing or consuming your video, you'll actually appreciate the multimedia aspect of it, right? By understanding that developing audio content also develops the auditory senses of your audience at hand, then you actually appreciate and enjoy building audio content. And it makes you even appreciate how your voice sounds, and even kind of motivates you to develop your vocabulary, your tonality, your vocal cords, your audio projection, and the way you go about impressing upon the audio world, right? Or the auditory realm, if you will. So by essentially enabling one's consciousness to take conscious sight of these truths, you just become the best of who you can be, because now you have a North Star and you have something you can point to that you can tangibly work on, right? Now, the final point that I wanted to make is that in this, you're also able to get a better sense of how to most effectively reach someone, right? I like to say that the spirit has its own airs, spelled AEHRSS or ERHSS. And so what that means is sometimes you feel like doing something, sometimes you do not. But by you having that understanding, you're actually able to more seek to cultivate and nurture those moments of opportunity in which you are willing to be open-minded. You are willing to be clearing your approach, not just clearing your approach, but open to challenging your own viewpoints, to having contrasting frameworks about how the way the world works be presented to you, and thereby even look at them at a deeper level and see if they could be of greater use to you, right? By that, the karmic imprint that one leaves when they decide to play at that level makes for a more beneficial to the evolution of not just their message, not just their approach, but the overall audience that they reach, because they garner not just the respect of those that they immediately cater to, but they also create, you can call it future project or projective future relations that will bloom upon certain causes and conditions in order to maybe facilitate one particular cause or endeavor, one particular financial benefit or another, or even altogether create something of the great revolution of the past or another, right? It's not in the small things, or it's not in the big things that we bring about change or we go about making an impact, but it's in the small iterative steps that are consciously and thoroughly thought of on a moment to moment, second to second, day by day level that essentially facilitate this fluid, you can call it almost non-interventional touching and crafting of the person that we will become, right? In that, it is also important to know that that is why maintaining that certain level of excellence or having a particular adherence to a standard that makes you appreciate what you do, causing you to play at a better level of produce or a higher quality of approach than what you would most likely have done, will in real time factually bring you closer to what you want, right? Now, there was a point that I wanted to make about how there's the synergy of the three elements that I brought up earlier: message, modicum of transmission, and the emotional current have to do with a person's overall ability to consume the material in the way that is most likely to generate change within them, and how that ties into the actual moment that they find themselves in. In this day and age, as it currently stands, there is a huge proliferation of smart tech devices, specifically smartwatches. It is my belief that the future will look something to the sorts of, by having an idea of your overall phenotype. So think brainwave, right? So you literally see the waveform on the clock, right? And then energy, input, output, and likelihood of energy storage, right? So how likely, how much kilojoules of energy you spend in a unit of time, right? How much kilojoules how many grams or milliliters of water get burnt? Like, how quickly does heart rate change, right? And then how that factors into the overall metabolic temperature baseline of the body, thereby creating a sort of calculus that allows one to factor in how quickly they raise energy temperature or decrease energy temperature, right? So for those who are nerds, it's having to do with overall ADP, ATP, and NADH or NADP. I forgot which one it was. NAD plus, right? So like how much of that are present in the body? And then essentially going about that to make valuable, accurate, suggestive recommendations that one can directly act on. Meaning, It would just be, well, you're pear shaped, right? So you have a big top and you have you have small legs, or big boobs, small legs, or you're apple shaped. You have big boobs and big legs, right? Or you're pear shaped. You have a small top and like big legs, right? Or big ass, whatever. And so that gives you what I call a root characteristic waveform profile for the overall phenotype that person rests or is at in that real time moment. Thereby, now, when AR instruments tied to the central nervous system, immunology, electrical impulse, cause for an oversaturation of an object like a chocolate, a tree, a flower, a mushroom, some random object that may look arcane to you, right? But is has been very quickly analyzed for its protein, fat content, and overall, if you can call it, element table, periodic table state, right? Like the overall composition, atomic structure, etc., deemed to be of vital importance to you in this moment to raise maybe energy storage, or to raise the propensity at which you burn more kilojoules per unit of time, right? Thereby allowing you to make informed decisions. In my opinion, that's where we're headed, right? Not just phenotypes, but also brainwave entrainment. The best way that I put it this is, we will get to a point where if I want to be productive, I will simply click a button and all the mirror neurons motor functions, so think raising the eliciting the response in our body to cause the manufacturing of chemicals that make me excited about doing work, while simultaneously also creating or energizing the body by creating or raising the electron level, causing ADP to be essentially more presently found in the system itself, right? Will lead to my absolutely being productive in every sense of the word, right? Simple, I guess, example of this, I would highly recommend y'all to check out this app called iDoser. The point is to essentially foster the brain waves and identify the actual neurotransmitters that are pertaining to palpably distinct states of mind: productivity, excitement, passion, lust, right? Depression, self-exploration, inner discovery, clairvoyance, right? There's so many. In order to actually facilitate the actual alignment of the procurement of capital that are necessary to completely and effectively be in those states of mind and achieve the respective objective and missions at hand, right? In the most benevolently beneficial fashion. There's a lot. Even I felt that one. Anyways, hope you guys got something out of this. And as always, swag the fuck out. Maps on the fucking game that come or that do the job at essentially what I call putting into practice this concept of the azimuth, or azimuth. What the fuck is the azimuth? It's basically, the simplest way that I would put it is your relation, literally your geophysical relation to the sun, the moon, and where you are on the globe. Quite simply, it is basically one's
absolute position between the North and the South Pole, right? For those of y'all who are into engineering, electrical engineering, who are into geopolitical, I don't want to use geopolitical science, but environmental science, right? My activist or whatever. This is essentially the characteristic that goes into defining magnetic fields, right? How one's literal physical body is used to, or how one's physical body essentially uses the natural properties of what I would just simply refer to as flux, electron flow, electron polarity, and the interaction of said electron charges with the natural world around them, right? That's literally the bare definition that I would get into with flux. There's a bit more that goes into it, and if you want a solid, if you want to call it picture or multi-dimensional representation of this, simply press your start button, view the map, and just be still for 5, 7, 11, 13 seconds, and you'll get a good picture of what I'm talking about. As you do this, you will see how the war zone, the combat situation essentially evolves. You'll see how at some point your mates are moving rapidly in one direction and the next they're not. You'll see them fucking die, right? You'll see Tango literally, quite literally pop up and then disappear on the map because niggas don't walk around with silencers, right? You'll see all this shit, and you can essentially say that this gives you a calculus as to what the fuck is going on, right? If you were ever curious as to how to go about actually cultivating what I call combat IQ, this is literally the best way, or the one way to fucking do it. Just meditate on the situation at hand and just pay attention to like everything, even like the shit that you think is like trivial. Like, for example, I guarantee you 99% of you did not notice that the square at the top left corner of the screen actually gives you a north, south, east, and west direction. I guarantee you most of y'all completely missed that. And it's like one of the things that's been there just chilling in the background for like the longest time that no one even, most people don't even employ or utilize in their overall gameplays, right? Little things like that. I bet you most of y'all did not realize that on the right hand side, as long with keeping a solid KD, like a solid record of your kill, death, and assist streak, the scoreboard also gives you a heads up of who's next to you, who is the next player that is a kill higher than yours, and then sometimes even it shows you who's the first player, like who is the one who has the most kills on the team. Why is this important? Well, if you're looking for what I call employing the buddy war system, then this gives you a solid idea of who to back up, right? Little shit like that. Little shit that if you're, as I put it, not present to the moment, you will completely miss. Now, going back to the AZIMUTH, or azimuth, why is this important? Because if you realize just the bare truth or nature of how the physics of a weapon, how you go about building a weapon, then you'll realize that where I am on the globe actually has a higher, it has a greater factor to actually contributing whether or not I'm going to be accurate and precise. So, quickly defining this, accuracy is actually hitting your target. Like when you scope someone in, you actually scope in a zone or a section in the screen that is pertaining to their body, therefore making it to where you actually hit them when the weapon is fired. Precision is like consistently hitting headshots, like consistently hitting a particularly denoted region of a target body area, right? Does that make sense? Okay. Now, the azimuth is important because if you understand that on the north side of the equator, right? So the globe, for those of y'all who don't know, there is this line called the equator line that essentially, quite literally, splits the globe in equal and opposite halves, right? And it does so by this concept of the magnetic poles. You can essentially say that there is such a place on the globe where quite effectively the magnetic fields in that region are essentially nullified or rendered to be not really a contributing factor to the overall system that are the fields present in that region, right? That's one way of putting it. There's a bit more that goes into it, but I would just leave it at that, right? Basically, at that region in the map, it's essentially not changing, right? Things do not really change on the magnetic level. Now, to bring it back to game speak, you have to always remember that even though things look stable, like you're crouched, you're walking through a particular area, and it seems like if there's no change in altitude, right? Like the level at which the ground is raised from the floor, even though that might be the case, it's actually not. I mean, look at this picture right now. Their stairs literally denote a raise in altitude, right? What I want you to do is to every single time you see that, you essentially envision a raise in altitude to signify that you are getting closer to the sun, right? Closer to the sun means a raise in altitude. Further away from the sun means you are at a lower altitude. Now, why is this important? Well, let's simply go back to this concept that I brought up earlier of splitting the globe into two halves. Let's say that the upper half has this, what I call, root characteristic attitude, or root characteristic wave baseline of only wanting to remain cold, and particularly having, you can call it racist bias for getting hot, right? Let's say that the lower half has this root characteristic attitude of only wanting to remain hot and having a racist bias for essentially getting cold, right? So the top likes to get cold, the top likes to stay cold or get cold, and the bottom likes to stay hot or get hot, right? Now, linking it back to what I just mentioned, when you're closer to the sun, you're getting hotter, right? And when you're further away from the sun, you are getting colder. Now, let's do one quick thing. So, for those of you who have been paying attention, you'll notice that, like, when it comes to space travel and aeronautics, we have come a long, long way. In fact, one of the greatest technological advancement we have realized is the concept of essentially using combustion as a method of propelling oneself through space and time. As some of y'all know, when you the law of motion, meaning an object at rest stays at rest, a law in motion stays in motion unless acted upon by another or external object, is quite literally seen in space-time extremely clearly, meaning you can just be floating forever onwards unless you find a way at the speed and force with the same magnitude that you essentially push yourself off initially. And because of that, it actually makes traveling or flying through space quite an interesting, you could put it an interesting journey, because the sense of it makes it to where you have to find other ways of steering, of turning, of increasing force or increasing speed and decreasing speed that you don't really have to deal with on Earth, right? Because of this, scientists have realized that the moment upon which we leave the atmosphere could actually be used, and then other key moments after that, like the moment when you could call it stabilization speed occurs, and some other key critical times in the launching of a space rocket, right? These are moments that could actually be capitalized as times when energy could essentially be repurposed, right? So think of it like when a space rocket launches from Earth, right? It first, like, just think of a giant, big ass fucking small bomb, basically, right? That's what's happening. And then that bomb explosion, instead of just letting it expand like a mushroom cloud, is like funneled extremely focused in like in an extreme focused way into this chute, right? The chute now like conducts that explosion and to a particular point in the ground on space time, to where now, as opposed to the explosion just like if you call it taking up x-axis space, just goes in a variety of multi-dimensional directions. So it's like a controlled explosion. And so now, because of that, we are essentially trying to ensure that it not only just does not go into the x-axis direction, but more specifically, it is focused towards an upwards y-axis movement, if you want to put it. That's essentially what lifts the rocket up, and boom, away we go, right? Now, as we leave the atmosphere, as we get closer to leaving Earth, there is also another rise in heat, right? Like, and why all of this essentially takes extreme amounts of energy, right? And so, as this occurs, literally sometimes parts of the rocket literally burn off, right? So scientists have realized that because of this, you could essentially capitalize on the fact that things are burning off, things are getting ripped apart, has a way of essentially repurposing extra, you can call it momentum energy, that is created from the sheer aspect of carcass just peeling off the rocket to just create more things that the rocket can push off of and gain greater force, if you want to put it in magnitude, to push itself off and get more power and essentially cover greater distance as it travels through space and time. Because oil is expensive, right? So if we can just use the physics of the momentum created and the energy created at that moment, we can essentially save money on fuel, right? And it's quite funny enough, something that should be thought about when thinking about even the trajectory or the projectile trajectory of a bullet, right? Now, what the fuck do I mean by this? Well, as a bullet travels through space and time, it also most likely will pick up heat, right? An object stays in motion unless acted upon by another external force, right? This is why basically your bullet gets hot, because it's just encountering objects as it's flying through time. And the sheer force of it causes it to puncture through these objects. Nevertheless, though, there is still an exchange of energy, and that energy is typically manifested in the resulting raise in temperature. Now, to bring it back to this concept of azimuth, or basically realize that as a bullet reaches a higher temperature set point, there is a higher tendency that it's going to decrease in traveling distance, right? Now, it's pretty interesting then, because it's almost as if there is a relationship between what I call penetration or punching power and traveling distance that is created, right? So let me take a step back and explain what I'm saying. Imagine that your sniper rifle is not the sniper rifle you see right here, but because you don't have iron, you don't have steel, You don't have all the metals required to essentially forge that long ass fucking chamber that makes the sniper, you can call it, mouth, right? Along with the chamber at which through which the bullet will essentially travel and exit your sniper rifle gun. All you have is a set of fucking PVC tubes, right? What do you fucking do? Well, in order to increase the length and reach of your essentially what will come to be a PVC made sniper rifle is you define an absolute north, right? You take this long ass cylindrical PVC tube, and you're like, okay, the bullet is gonna travel from here to here, right? So the place where it's gonna go to, that's your absolute north, right? It's heading that way. And then basically, what you do is anytime you want to extend the length of your sniper rifle, you just bolt on a PVC tube with a smaller diameter to the original PVC tube in question, right? That's basically the definition of reach, right? And so what happens now is with every subsequent PVC tube that's added, not only is the reach increased, but then also you have to think of error, right? Error is also added in that. Because what if, for example, the screw that I added at the end, basically you drill a hole in your PVC tube, you fit on a screw, and then you take a PVC tube with a smaller concentric diameter, and then you just tack those two things on together, right? Now, in doing this, what if you didn't grind down the screw that connected the two tubes together in such a way that it doesn't poke out, in such a way that it's not seeped into the overall, you can call it, chamber of where the bullet will be traveling through, right? That's one point of contention. That's literally one place where error can be added. Because basically, as the bullet exits the chamber, what will happen is it will bounce off of the fucking screw in question, right? And cause, if you want to call it, a trajectory path of your bullet to be skewed, right? The second thing is the bolting process itself, right? Like, imagine if the way that you go about bolting the two PVC tubes, so the original one and the inner PVC tube with a smaller concentric diameter, is done in such a way where it's not properly fastened on together. What will happen? Well, you will essentially have a loose weapon. Think of your burger. Imagine if the burger you got wasn't like a nice and pat down burger with like your tomatoes, your lettuce, your onions, they were nice and like packed down. But imagine if it was like this loose shit where your burger, your lettuce, your tomatoes were almost like they weren't properly. I want to use the word packed down, but they weren't properly stacked on top of one another, and so shit was just falling all over the place. Basically, like your tomato and your lettuce was just like sliding to one side or to the other. You can't even properly pick up the burger. That's essentially what you get when you have these situations. When you have PVC extenders that are not properly fastened onto one another, the result is you get a loose weapon. So you ever get those sniper rifles, for example, the SVD in Call of Duty Mobile, where basically you laser in a target, but you don't even hit it because the sight, the scope, the lens themselves are not fastened onto each other, causing an improper lasering in of the desired target, right? That's literally just basically things are not fastened and bolted onto each other. Another reason, another cause, or another problem that this causes is what I call tressaillement, which is literally translated to the stabilization instability. So whenever you're lasering in your sniper rifle and the sniper rifle essentially moves around a little bit, because what's happening is the soldier essentially has to factor for the fact that like the reach of the sniper rifle was so long that at times gravity is essentially unevenly distributed. Now, how I verged onto this point may not actually be principally how I wanted to broach the topic of center of mass dynamics, right? Basically, just think of your car, right? Think of a well-balanced car. Think of a Tesla, for example, where from the get-go, everything was done. I don't know if y'all read Tesla X, but that's a really good book, by the way. The autobiography of Elon Musk. It's a really dope book. But basically what was done is from the get-go, he thought of things like center of mass, of essentially ensuring that the product evenly distributed gravity and the normal force, and dealt with the normal force in such a way that the weight that the car held was not particularly concentrated at one area, like the front wheels, like most trucks, or another area like the back mount, where the bed of some 4 and 5 wheelers, right? That we have in today's day and age. Like, he wanted to ensure that that didn't occur, because what would happen is it would cause a tipping in the hydraulic system of the car, right? So some of y'all wonder, why the fuck do I spend so much gas? Well, does your car lean the fuck over like a fat kid in some sneakers? Probably because of that. Like, literally, it's not even at rest when it comes to the balance. And then on top of that, you add all this extra padding and fat to make it what you think look nice. But in reality, all it does is it just fattens it even more again. And then it weighs it down. And then you're confused by the fact that, like, your motor engine has to like overcome all this extra physics. What the fuck? Like, literally makes no sense, right? So he thought of all these things, and so that's why it results in a superior product that not only distributes power, energy, and the physics of gravity evenly, but then also dollar per dollar, wattage per wattage, spends little to no energy output inefficiently, right? Now, bringing it back to the gun and the sniper rifle, this is essentially the concept of front-loaded weapons and back-loaded weapons, right? Some weapons, you essentially literally, no matter what you do, have to account for what I call the kick, right? When basically the bullet exits the chamber at a supremely high velocity, causing a jolt upwards or downwards depending on where you are in the globe. I will come back to this. And then essentially leading to a loss in or error in the overall accuracy of the weapon itself, right? Some weapons are backloaded, essentially resulting in what I call the tilt, which is essentially you're having to factor in its actual length, like the sniper rifle, causing you to actually aim downwards and sometimes or aim upwards depending on the situation at hand, right? Now, to bring it back to the azimuth, right, or the globe, basically the point that I'm trying to make is, as a bullet travels through time, these are the principal elements that literally lend to its traveling distance or its penetration power. The set point at which, at baseline, it rests at. Basically, how hot or cold is the bullet itself, right? The lower the bullet typically lends to the greater the traveling distance, right? And then the hotter the bullet will typically lend to the greater the penetration or punching power it will have. Just think of your shotguns to your sniper rifles. And then it also kind of gives you greater appreciation for why bullets are shaped the way they are, right? Like, the very geometry of a bullet literally has tactical and strategic advantages that we should also pay attention to and take advantage of, right? Now, bringing it back and tying it to the overall course of a bullet trajectory, just think of this is projectile trajectory for my physics. Just think of r cosine theta and r sine theta, right? The goal is to always ensure that for a weapon, r sine or r cosine theta remains true, meaning you're always trying to ensure that the x-axis is optimized and that the calculus for the y-axis is minimized, r sine theta. So for those of y'all who ever wondered, oh, I'm never going to use math, it's useless. Well, my friend, you shall be wrong, and this is how you are. Stay in school, niggas. Now, going further, when you think about it, also kind of helps you factor in just how to go about analyzing a weapon for error. Like, for example, ensuring that a bullet doesn't bounce around in the chamber before exiting the mouth of the gun, right? Like, because of the added screws that were formerly mentioned, right? Those are literal and concrete objective things that you can work on. Now, upon leaving the bullet, there's also a change in temperature, has quickly mentioned, or has mentioned previously, where as it travels through time, it will most likely pick up temperature, and then that will also lend to the overall distance that the bullet will travel itself, right? So you clearly can see the dichotomy or relationship between traveling distance and penetration power that is essentially caused by the velocity at which the bullet leaves the gun itself, right? So a bullet with a high velocity exit, you can say, may, if set with or if built with a lower temperature set point, travel a greater distance, right? Or a bullet with a lower or created with a lower temperature set point, but having an extremely small exit velocity may in fact travel a greater distance, right? Conversely, a bullet with a high temperature set point and essentially exiting or having an exit velocity that is extremely high will most likely not have a high traveling distance. And a bullet with a high or built with a high temperature set point and essentially having a low temperature or low exit velocity will most likely have a greater traveling distance and also a decent punching power or penetration distance punching power or traveling distance. So again, a bullet with a high temperature set point or built with a high temperature set point, like a hot bullet, but also with a low exit velocity. So it has a high temperature set point, but it's exiting the gun at a low velocity, will have the greater chances of having a high traveling distance while simultaneously maintain high penetration power or punching power, right? Now, to translate this back into the azimuth, when you are at, recall the two halves, right? Like a globe, you split it in two using the equator. If you find yourself on the upper half, you have a region that is predominantly cold favoring. It loves the cold and it dislike or it's racist to the hot, to heat, to getting hot basically. And if you find yourself in the lower half, then you essentially find yourself in a region that loves the heat and adores getting hot and has a strong racist bias for getting cold, right? Now this means, to translate it back to game speak, that if you find yourself at some section of the map or the game where you're at a higher altitude, or as I put it simply, when you are closer to the sun, then this translates to being at the lower half of the equator, which conversely means that you are essentially factoring for the fact that you will be at a higher disadvantage when it comes to traveling distance, right? You will most likely essentially have a higher punching power or penetration power, right? Now, what this translates to is essentially there's a higher chance that your gun will kick up. It will literally rock up as you are blasting a target. And so it's actually conducive to the accuracy of your overall marksmanship capabilities to actually be scoping downwards or scoping using a click that is factoring for upward mobility, if you want to put it that way. Like as you are firing your gun, the trajectory of your gun will actually be going upwards. And so start or laser in the a lower section of the target because you will most likely find yourself in an upward section by the end of your blast, right? Conversely, if you find yourself in the part of the map where you're at a lower altitude and thus further away from the sun, this translates to being on the upper half of the equator and thus means that you essentially have to scope upwards because you are factoring for the fact that you are most likely at a higher traveling distance advantage, but you are lacking an extremely high exit velocity. So essentially, your bullet will travel further, but it will most likely not penetrate or have a high punching power. And therefore, all of your bullets will be flying essentially. So the idea that was actually a really dope ass explanation of it. Another way of thinking about it, if you want to simplify it, is to think of the actual carbolipid molecular structure that's at hand. Basically, you have lipids or complex fatty acids, even more complex fatty acids, and extremely complex long chain carbon, oxygen, hydrogen bonded fatty acids, as he mentioned. And basically, what the simplest sugar have very small, what you call a carbon backbone, right? And because of that, there is a low. Look at this cat. Basically, there's a low energy requirement that is necessary to break apart the bonds and essentially break them down. This is essentially saturated and unsaturated fats, right? That's the definition of it. And then the next thing that occurs basically is whenever a bond is broken down, energy is released, and you have the creation of what he mentioned, ADP, adenosine triphosphate, blah, 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 blah. I forgot the complete name, right? But you have ATP created, which is basically the energy unit of the body, right? Now, what's interesting, and as he brought it up, is that with processed foods, the tendency for the molecular compound at hand to essentially, in order to maintain homeostasis, build those long chain carbon oxygen backed structures is extremely high, extremely high. And on top of that, in order to essentially break down the bonds in these particular atoms, you will not only require essentially more reactions to essentially change the substance or cause what I call state of matter conversion processes, as he mentioned, like burning, freezing, condensation, even adding water, right, or air, basically, playing with hydrogen and oxygen, in order to overall affect or cause chemical reactions to occur that will cause the necessary loss or gain or basically overall change of electron flow to occur. So for those of y'all who are kind of Wondering what I'm talking about? Remember when we used to balance your kind of chemical equations, right? That's literally what he was talking about. And one interesting point is that there's oftentimes a prevalent transmission or exchange of carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, and phosphorus. Specifically phosphorus, and in the sense of sodium, the way the cell interacts, the way water moves from one end to the other, the way that the cell essentially requires constant energy for this to occur, and then ultimately the way the pancreas, the intestines, and the overall internal world at hand plays a massive part in ensuring that this always occurs in a way that is done in tandem with overall metabolic activity. Put simply, if I make the water extremely acidic at one point, we also need a counter agent that makes it basic at some point, or else you'll just like burn your fucking internal walls. Like you'll literally acidify yourself to death. Conversely, if I need to raise the water and make it sugary or basic in nature in terms of pH level, we need a counter agent that at a later time makes it acidic, right? Or else you will literally bleach yourself out. And thus is the fucking nature of reality as it pertains to hydration, dehydration, saturation, desaturation, if you want to put it, and the overall state of being lit. Hope that made sense.
This one cleanses the blood and all of the internal or eternal organs. And then this one.
Now, to bring it back into a more concrete objective or a more concrete application, sugars that come from fruit or naturally occurring food tend to have this propensity of being simple in organization, right? You have things called simple sugars and complex sugars and even more complex sugars, right? The fruit, or the more natural or organically occurring the food is, the way that it came to being, the higher the likelihood that it is composed of simple sugars, which by nature are simple to break down and essentially a causer of what you will call clean energy. And so for that, I need to make a quick step back. In that process of building energy, there are essentially two primal ways in which the body does this. One way is through what's called the ATP cycle, where basically through the raising of energy, the body essentially creates this energy unit called ATP, right? But there are times when resources are not currently present in order to create this unit, the body will actually go on to, you can call it synthetically manufacture complementary, or what, sorry, the body will actually go on to create what you can essentially deem as replacement or temporary replacers that act or perform the functions of these key critically currently missing resources, right? So any of y'all familiar with the Krebs cycle or keto diets? That's literally what they're talking about. In the process of having a lack of glucose and carbohydrates present, what will happen is the body will actually break down proteins, and through a really systematic process of hydration, dehydration, causing a change in, I think it's like sodium, phosphorus, and zinc and calcium, like some other key like macronutrients, will essentially cause the genesis of, you can call it variants of ATP, right? Now, the way that it's done, because of basically, it's not, I don't want to use the word unnatural, but think of it like riding a bike, right? Think of, for example, as a designer, you design a bike to have a bike tire of 27 inches in diameter, right? But because of the way you build the bike, your bike is actually able to fit like a 26-inch diameter tire or even a 28-inch diameter tire, right? It's built for optimum operation to take in or use 27 inches diameter bike tires, but it will also work with 26 and 28. That's the same thing with these keto related ATP energies, right? Where your body is actually by nature designed to use glucose, burn it down, and in that burning down process create clean energy, right? That will essentially become carbohydrates. But when not there, it will also take protein and macronutrient fused ATP energy cells that will also do the job of providing the energy required to function. So those are the two primal ways energy is done. And in this, one can clearly see the distinction in what we more now so commonly push as a striving for personal excellence and to play for the state of mind that you find yourself in. Because if you can refine the energy that you operate at on a day-to-day level, you can essentially effectually take control of the baseline set point at which your body rests, at rest, when you're not doing shit. And thus overall raise the standard by which it's able to essentially deem to be good enough, causing impact and change to occur in that moment itself, right? So foods like fruits, vegetables, essentially are clean or contributors of creators of clean energy because of the simpleness of the atomic structures that the resource that they provide give to us. Swag out.
Only other food that I got is fructose. Now, what?
Actually, look at it. One of the reasons why I fucking adore this map is because, in my opinion, it allows me to essentially put into practice this concept called the azimuth, AZIMUTH, right? And on top of that, it's literally the perfect groundwork for really identifying, assessing, and getting like a personal relationship with your arsenal and your weapons, right? Like, what are the overall ballistics that go towards the building of what you carry on a day-to-day gameplay, right? Is it front-loaded? Is it back-loaded? Is it evenly distributed? How well does it play with the concept of azimuth and how it ties into overall set temperature points and the dichotomy that is present between traveling distance and punching power, right? So to break this down, the simplest way that I'd put it is that for one to get a good sense of how well their actual weapon is, let's just take it in the simplest way possible, right? I'll use the sniper rifle as a base case simply because, like, by nature, I think I am a sniper, like archer, that type of shit, and like marksmanship is like my love. Like the art of getting something right and on target literally makes me cry with like joy because there's just so much that can happen that the possibility that we have within us the capacity of hitting things miles and miles and kilometers away is just baffling, right? Just think about that sheer reality. Not just that, but the fucking see things that are even further away than that. If one is just to train themselves on the art of scanning, right? Now, how I brought it in the past was to essentially think of the sniper rifle not as the long iron bar made chamber that we so commonly see or we most likely carry in this current moment, right? For example, in the game, but has a set of cylindrical PVC tubes that are fastened upon one another, right? Put simply, were I to not have the metals on hand to build and iron forge my sniper rifle together, I would have to come up with some other form of essentially creating something that has length, so something long, like a long dick. Something that is essentially well distributed to where whenever I put something through it, an object, and then I essentially cause that object to exit it at a high velocity, it still is matched with the projectile trajectory that was originally scoped at its before it exited, right? So basically, precision, right? So accuracy is when you scope a target in and you hit them, right? Precision is when you can literally consistently say, okay, I want to hit the head and I hit the head. I want to hit their toe and I fucking hit their toe. I want to hit their finger and I fucking hit their finger over and over and over and over again, right? Repeatedly and consistent and on will, essentially, right? That's precision. Now, the way that I always brought this up or how I broke this down was to look at it in terms of literal mathematics, like physics, right? For my engineers, this is r cosine theta and r sine theta, right? What we're seeking to do is maximize the equation that has to do with the x-axis, so r cosine theta, right? Because that essentially ensures that as I'm scoping a target in and I press the trigger, it literally goes straight or in a as straight as possible trajectory path to that target. It doesn't take any wheelie-nilly shit. It doesn't like go up and down or whatever. It just goes straight to where I'm looking at, right? That is the art of essentially building scopes, right? Like lensing shit in, properly making sure your sights are not just fastened together, and that's pretty much what I will come on to, but are also literally pointed in the same direction, right? Like, could you imagine like your scope is literally like pointing like to the right of you, and so you think you're looking at something, but you're actually, your gun is literally pointed towards something else, like meaning when you trigger or you press the trigger, it's actually going to go in a radically different direction, right? That's kind of what I'm talking about. Now, going further with this concept of the PVC tube, imagine that essentially for me to extend the reach, the length of my PVC tube, what I need to do is essentially take another PVC tube with a smaller diameter than the one that I currently have, drill a hole into it, and then screw it to what I originally have now, right? So what you do is you take the original PVC tube, you say, okay, it's gonna go, the bullet is gonna travel outwards, right? It's gonna leave the gun at this point, in this direction. So that's my absolute north, right? And then the next thing it's gonna do is it's just gonna fly forever, right? So that means that the end of that PVC tube and where I say the mouth will be is where I'm gonna fasten the second PVC piece, right? So then what I'll do is I'll take it, I'll drill a hole towards the bottom, most likely, or something, and then I'll take a PVC tube with a smaller diameter, right? Like, just think of like your old school letters, right? They would roll it up in a parchment or a parcel, whatever, and then they would just fit it into like this little round holder, if you will, right? And that will essentially create an extension, right? You will essentially increase the length of the chamber in that way. Now, I'm so glad that maybe I got lucky that English was my second language, because it forces me to be explicitly verbose at times when I feel it not to be necessary, because then you get an illustration, even as I'm saying this, that holy shit, that's literally a point of contention, like a point where error might be introduced in the whole firing scenario, right? Like, just as like you might first of all not even be scoped onto their target properly, but literally in the act of the bullet traveling through the chamber itself, it might be bouncing up and down across points where the screws are, causing this addition of upon the y-axis upon my projectile trajectory, right? So that's something you should always think about, right? Like, am I adding y-axis jolt to my projectile trajectory? Now, furthermore, let's go on to this concept of bullet travel, right? The best way that I would illustrate this is SpaceX or just space travel, right? I don't know, by the way, if y'all have gotten a chance, I would highly, highly suggest you read Elon Musk's book. It's actually a phenomenal fucking read, because he really, he makes it extremely clear just how fucking monumentous it is to take on something like space travel. Like, it's literally a miracle that the shit just doesn't explode, because what you realize is has objects exit the atmosphere, for them to essentially reach that point of like extremely high altitude, they have to essentially be exerting a lot of fucking energy. Like, a lot. Like, that's why that shit is like beat fucking red. Like, it gets burning fucking hot. And because of that, what has actually essentially caused the evolution of the engineering process of it is that we now go about factoring that moment of exiting within the calculation of gas consumption and the journey itself. As we have learned, an object stays in motion unless acted upon by another force. We then realize that upon exiting the atmosphere, when carcass starts to essentially be shed from the spacecraft itself, they actually produce a sort of, you can call it propelling momentum, that could be leveraged by the spacecraft in order to push itself forward, to increase force and magnitude, and to essentially gain greater travel, you can call it distance and inertia, and thus essentially bringing down overall fuel requirements to propel us to our end destination, right? So that has actually been a strategy that has now become an active implementation technique to essentially further the overall traveling distance for one particular spacecraft. Now, in that, it also translates to actual ballistics, or if you call it bullet dynamics, meaning if you build a bullet that has a low temperature set point, then by effect you're actually increasing the chances that it will have greater traveling distance. The reason is that as a bullet travels through air, it also encounters objects, right? Like pieces of gravel, a fucking random bird, some wall, that will essentially cause an interaction of energy, leading to the overall increase or raise in temperature of the bullet itself, making it extremely hot, right? So as time goes and it travels, it also most likely will get hotter as well, right? Conversely, if you build a bullet that has extremely high temperature by nature at its conception, you in effect raise the chance that it will actually be stronger or have high, what I call punching power, right? Or penetration power. Kind of like your shotguns, right? It's like literally like, it's a violent weapon. Like, the jolt of the fucking shotgun exiting the bullet at an extremely high velocity, but also being at an extremely high, or you can say medium to high temperature baseline set point causes you to feel that in the moment of combustion itself, right? So to kind of scale it or bring it back into alignment, there is a moment when there is nothing happening, like the object, the bullet is just in the chamber that has not been fired. And then there is a moment of combustion. You can think of it as an explosion that occurs when the trigger is essentially pressed. And then the bullet travels through the chamber, right? And then there is a moment of exit when it leaves the gun itself and then is out into air, if you want to put it, right? In that, you can essentially say that the main variables are exit velocity and then overall set point temperature for the bullet itself. So a cold bullet, by this logic, will have a high traveling distance, and a hot bullet, by this logic, will have a high punching power, high penetration power, or a high or a low traveling distance, right? I'm, of course, overgeneralizing a lot of things because the reality of it is actually geometry plays a major part into these actual elements. Like, for example, the reason why a sniper rifle bullet is long like that is because of what I just mentioned, right? They are trying to combat these very physics. Or why like shotgun shells are built in that way, right? They're done for a specific reason. But if you can get the overall sense, like what I call the base case for why we do these things, you can gain greater clarity and even start being like a fucking power ninja, combining the right ingredients to build the cake of your desires, so to speak, right? Now, bringing it back to this overall motif of azimuth, the best way that I would put it is imagine that you have a globe, right? And upon this globe, you split it into equal and contrasting elemental halves, right? The upper half is essentially represented by what I would call a root characteristic profile that has the attitude of desiring or doing everything it can to remain cold and having a racist bias for getting hot, right? And then conversely, the lower half has what I call a root characteristic attitude or profile of desiring to remain hot and having a racist bias for being cold, right? So these are the two halves. If you find yourself on the upper half, you basically only want to be cold. And if you find yourself on the lower half, you basically want to be hot, right? To translate this into game speak, basically if you ever find yourself at a part of the map where you are in effect you are in effect further from the sun, then you, by this logic, find yourself in the upper half of the equator. Thus, in order to essentially improve your accuracy and even increase your precision, you must imagine or anticipate an error that will cause for upward mobility or an upward jolt, right? You can think of it as because you are at a lower altitude, right, or further away from the sun, you have a higher tendency of being cold and thus to slouch. This means that you must essentially be pointing up, right? You must be pointing up because you have a higher tendency of slouching down. Conversely, if you find yourself at a higher altitude point in the map, you are by this logic essentially closer to the sun, which essentially translates to essentially having the tendency of essentially getting what I call feeling the kick, right? So what will happen is as you're firing your gun, the tendency that essentially shoots up, it moves up, is extremely high, which means that you must essentially scope down, right? You start or you precise a point on your target that is a lower area of their body and you fire, because what will happen is as you longer fire, your gun will actually be going up and up and up and up like that. So basically, if you're at the lower part of the equator, you scope down. If you're at the higher part of the equator, you scope up. If that makes sense, please test it out for yourself and see if you reach level elite in no time. Hope you guys got something out of this. And as always, swag the fuck out. As a quick PS, if any of y'all are into One Piece, this is essentially how the azimuth is used. Nami and her little watch thing causes readings for magnetic fields and polarity to be read, and that's how they go about swagging through the grand line. Swagging through the grand line. Just field surfing. Without care. Cheers. Another thing to look up to is the sextant, spelled S-E-X-T-A-N-T. And it'll give you a better reading on everything I just kind of said. Hello.
And then to essentially put a nice bow on this nip, remember that at the end of the day, it's all about the breath. Are you diaphragmatic or not? Me personally, that's actually why I smoke. I've come to realize with these vape devices, as I'm going about my training, I can actually force myself to engage the core. When I smoke, I literally practice this diaphragmatic inhale, which means you push out your belly, right? So inhale, you push out your belly. Exhale, you push out the air. Inhale, exhale. Inhale, exhale. Kinda like the aforementioned sniper's breath hold that I talked about not too long ago. If you're looking for a litty ass product, check out UL E-Gloss, A-E-G-L-O-S. Its American counterpart ain't got shit on it. I know y'all niggas should be breaking on instant contact with the ground. This baby though, whew, it's gonna last you. Go to myul.com, call it in, make an order, and referral code my name. Steven, last name O-U-A-N-D-J-I. Pronounce Wanji. Steven Wanji. And they'll fucking get you situated proper. Proper link will be up soon. As when God introduced the concept of substance to us in the book of Genesis, you have stewardship over all. I give you dominion and mastery over everything that is. We should also, literally and quite easily, I have a plan, be able to make smoking a cost-effective and mutually beneficial activity, both in terms of health, wealth, and swag relationships. Hey, now who's not excited about that? About a vape product that actually infuses you with vitality instead of robbing you of personality. Swag the fuck out. Quite effectively putting this into, I guess, a swag hack or a one menial action item list that you can immediately implement in order to improve your life by 1% is, if you're on any sort of bodybuilding cycle right now, whether bulking or cutting, ask yourself before putting that food into your mouth is, what is the digestion time of this particular thing? i.e., how to build strength and burn fat, or the poor man's guide to burning fat and building muscle that I put out not too long ago, right? Think of the fire, That is your overall metabolic rate, activity, etc., physio, anatomy, etc., etc. Ask yourself how this food will essentially burn on the flame that currently is, right? And that essentially gives you a calculus for what to do. If it's gonna take a while to burn because there's already other things on the fucking pallet, then most likely you're dealing with something that has high fat, high carb, high or low water, right? Because the drier something is, oftentimes the harder it is, or the likelier you're going to actually have to saturate it with water before digesting it. So in this, you start thinking about, oh, what does my fucking pancreas, my intestines, the tract system that ingests my food, what is going to occur as I inhale this thing, right? And then what is the position in the overall queue of items that are to be broken down by acidity that is introduced by the bacteria and internal world that I currently have going on. And then ultimately, and this is the game changer, you take a deep breath, hold, 1, 3, 5. And then you ask yourself, what am I trying to accomplish again? Burn fat, decrease body mass, or decrease body fat contribution to overall totality of matter held by the body, or increase body fat, or increase overall weight that is essentially assessed or imprinted by my body onto the physical world, and then render a due, well perspectived and balanced judgment on whether or not eating this thing is good or not. It's all about the flame, or the fire in the belly. Light digesting foods always assist because they tend to be more organically based, have a sounder, or think of an equilateral triangle type of atomic geometric formation, and thus easy to interact with composition, while dark digesting foods or heavy to digest foods tend to have the opposite of this, right? Longer fatty acids, way more complex carb molecule, carbolipids glued together to break apart, etc., etc., etc. Hope this makes sense, and as always, swagged off buck out. Shit, she's a climber already. She's trying to climb l'arbre qui est à la maison. Derrière. Elle n'arrivait pas. I think she's been really sharpening her claws.